Welcome to The Explainer. What if you could get to a stateless society, not with protests or politics, but just by, well, opting out? That's the radical idea we're digging into today from Samuel Edward Konkin III's An Agorist Primer.
So, the primer kicks things off with this, right? Thought and action consistent with freedom. Sounds simple enough, but as the author himself points out, a word like freedom, well, things can get pretty complex pretty fast.
And right away, you realize this isn't your typical political manifesto. Not at all. The whole argument is framed as a practical, economic roadmap to liberty.
Okay, so it's a really bold vision, for sure. But what does that actually mean? How in the world would it work? To really get a handle on agorism, the book says we have to start by looking at the world through a very particular economic lens.
Yeah, that lens is economics. But, we're not talking about the kind of stuff you see on the news. Stock tickers, inflation reports, none of that. Instead, the entire philosophy here is built from the ground up on one single, really powerful economic idea. And that idea is something called subjective value. According to the primer, this is the absolute bedrock. It basically means that the worth of something isn't fixed. There's no such thing as an objective fair price. Value is totally in the eye of the beholder. Now, this one concept, it has huge implications. The primer argues it's the key to everything. It explains why we trade in the first place. It also completely demolishes exploitation theories like Marxism. And most importantly, it puts the individual, you, right at the center of the entire economic universe. All right, so we've got that foundation laid, that economic theory. Now the primer takes us from the abstract and drops us right into the real world. Let's see how this idea of individual value becomes the engine for the core practice of agorism.
And it gives it a name, counter-economics. Now, this is a term Konkin came up with to describe what, most of us would just call the black market or the gray market.
And the book is really clear on this. This is not some tiny fringe thing. We're talking about everything from under-the-table cash jobs to massive global smuggling rings. A huge chunk of the world's economy, it argues, is already humming along completely outside of the state's control.
To really make this idea concrete, the book gives us this amazing, vivid example. It takes us back to the 1970s, to American truckers who were suddenly faced with a new regulation that was absolutely crippling their ability to make a living.
See, they just couldn't make a profit driving that slow. So their incentive to break the law, it was massive. The only problem was the risk of getting busted by the highway patrol, Smokey Bear.
So what was the solution? The Citizens Band Radio, the CB. And this is the real kicker. This simple bit of tech allowed them to create this huge, decentralized network. They'd form convoys, warn each other about police, and they basically created this ordered highway anarchy that made the state's rule totally irrelevant. It worked.
Okay, so you've got this real-world practice, the counter-economy, but it needs some kind of moral framework, a philosophical backbone. And that's where the primer brings in libertarianism. Now, the book boils this entire, pretty complex philosophy down to one simple rule. You can do anything you want, literally anything, as long as you don't initiate force or violence against somebody else. That's it. And this principle sets up the central conflict of the whole book. It argues there are only fundamentally two ways to get stuff in this world. There's the political means, which is all about coercion, state power, taxes. And then there's the economic means, which is about creating things and trading voluntarily. The state versus the agora, the open marketplace.
So, you've got these two big ideas, right? On one hand, the real-world practice of the counter-economy. On the other, the moral theory of libertarianism. So the big question is, how do they finally come together?
And boom, here it is. This is the core definition. Agorism is the consistent integration of libertarian theory with counter-economic practice. It's consciously deciding to live out those libertarian principles using the counter-economy. So it's not just a belief system you talk about, it's a way you actually live.
And it gets super practical. The primer actually lays out a kind of formula for being a counter-economist. It says you should treat it like any other business decision. You calculate the potential profit, you estimate the risk, which is the penalty times the chance of getting caught, and if the profit is bigger than the risk, you go for it.
But, and this is crucial, this isn't just about you making a buck on the side. The book presents this whole thing as a complete strategy for revolutionary change. It actually outlines a whole four-phase strategy for this revolution. Phase 1, the counter-economy just grows. More and more people get involved. Phase 2. As it gets bigger, you start to see these Agorist condensations form. The goal is to get so big that you hit Phase 3. The state's tax base collapses. And that leads to Phase 4. The state just withers away, peacefully.
So in the end, the primer argues that the final battle isn't fought with guns or on the streets. It's fought in your mind. The state is only defeated when individuals, one by one, personally reject its authority. It's a revolution that happens through a withdrawal of consent, when enough people just stop playing the game and start building their own.
And that leaves us with a final thought, a question to chew on. If you start to view the world through this agorist lens, this division between the state economy and the counter-economy, where do you see that border today? Where does it lie in your own life? Because the primer suggests that once you start looking for it, you'll start seeing it absolutely everywhere.